So Harry asked me to speak today because he wasn't feeling all that well with his hearing. And he said I could speak on any subject I wanted. Any subject. Okay. Free reign, Mark. You've got free reign. And so I thought I would speak about an Old Testament character. That's what I thought. I thought I would speak about someone whose name has 4 letters, who begins with E. So, turn with me, would you please, into the book of Judges. Got you. Into the book of Judges, and Judges chapter 3. Judges chapter 3. It was very tempting to preach on Ezra, I can assure you, but I didn't succumb to that. Judges chapter 3, and we're going to read from verse 12. Now the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. And he gathered to himself the sons of Ammon and Amalek, and he went and defeated Israel, and they possessed the city of the palm trees, which of course is Jericho. The sons of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, for 18 years. But when the sons of Israel cried to the Lord raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. And the sons of Israel sent tribute by him to Eglon, the king of Moab. Ehud made himself a sword which had 2 edges, a cubit in length, and he bound it to his right thigh under his cloak. He presented the tribute to Eglon, the king of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. And it came about, when he had finished presenting the tribute, that he sent away the people who carried the tribute. But he himself turned back from the idols which were at Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. And he said, keep silence. And all who attended him left him. Ehud came to him, and whilst he was sitting alone in the cool chamber, and Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. And he arose from his seat. Ehud stretched out his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. The handle then went in after the belly, and the fat closed over the blade. For he did not draw his sword out of his belly, and the refuse came out. Then Ehud went out into the vestibule, shut the doors of the roof chamber behind him, and locked them. And when he had gone out, his servants came and looked, and behold, the doors of the roof chamber were locked, and they said, he is only relieving himself in the cool room. They waited until they became anxious, but behold, they did not open the doors of the roof chamber. Therefore they took the key and opened them, and behold, their master had fallen to the floor dead. Now Ehud escaped, and while they were delaying, and he passed by the idols and escaped to Sariah. It came about when he had arrived that he blew the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the sons of Israel went down with him from the hill country, and he was in front of them. He said to them, pursue them, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hands. So they went down after him. They seized the fords of the Jordan opposite Moab, and they did not allow anyone to cross. They struck down at that time about 10,000 Moabites, all robust and valiant men, and no one escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land was undisturbed for 80 years. Great story, I think, at least. You know, the nation of Israel at the times of the judges were living in this kind of on-off periods of limitation. They would turn away from God, and God would allow a neighboring people to oppress them, and then they called out to God for a deliverer, and God would raise up a deliverer or a savior, if you like, to come and save them. He would deal with the problem. He would lead the nation back into fellowship with God for a period of time, releasing them from the limitations that had been placed upon them before the cycle started all over again. You know what? They were not meant to live in that way. They were not meant to live lives that were limited or restricted. They were meant to live lives that reflected God. To be living lives that reflected his purposes and his plans. But it's very difficult to do that when you're threshing wheat in a wine press. It's difficult to do that when you're carrying a burden that is just too heavy for you to be able to bear yourself. It's very difficult to do that when you've lost sight of who you actually are. Ehud is, we've just read about, he's the second of these deliverers, these judges, which is spoken about during a 400-year period covered in the book of Judges. Othniel is the first of them. And when I think of Othniel, he was the nephew of Caleb, the mighty warrior Caleb. He was a nephew of him. But when I think of Othniel, I think of a Hollywood actor. I think of Jean-Claude Van Damme or Dolph Lundgren or a beefed-up Tom Cruise. That's what I think of when I think of Othniel. See, at the time of Othniel, the nation is oppressed. The people cry out. The Spirit of God comes upon him, and he goes into battle with his aviator sunglasses on and his hair wavy, blowing in the wind, the slow motion background, the slow motion 8K video, the background music going on, and in the background you've got this blurred image of the king of Mesopotamia, and the camera pans around to Othniel, who's straddling his way towards the victory celebration. That's how I view Othniel. A little bit like Tom Cruise, if you like. You know, when you need a judge, you need someone to look up to, someone to have a hope in, someone to trust in, someone to believe in. Othniel. Othniel is your man. But let me tell you who is not your man when you are getting oppressed by the Moabites. When they're taking your stuff and they're leaving you with just a limited amount of stuff left. That's Ehud. That's Ehud. He is not your man. See, when I think of Ehud, I don't think Tom Cruise. I think Danny DeVito. That's who's in my mind. Short guy. Balding. The thought of Ehud being your deliverer when you were in times of trouble, well, I may as well just give up now. If you were an Israelite and you told someone that your hope was in Ehud the Benjamite, you're going to be laughed out of the room. See, this guy was just so far out of place. It wasn't true. It seems to me that God tends to use people who don't seem to be the obvious choice. And Ehud, he stands out as someone who God used when others wouldn't have used, because he had a limitation. In fact, he had limitations. And for all the world, these limits upon his life should have got in the way of what he was called to do. And perhaps for a period of time, they did. But by the end of the story, we read about what God can do when someone learns to live beyond the limits. Limits that either we put upon ourselves or limits that we've been told about us by others. Limits that can have damaging effects upon how close we walk with God, about how fruitful we will be as believers. See, after Othniel, there was a peace and a tranquility in the land, but you know what? It didn't last. The nation disobeyed God. They did evil in the sight of God. They turned away, and God sends this Moabite king, a guy called Eglon, to oppress them. And for 18 years, Eglon is served by the Israelites. And each year, a tribute, possibly money, more likely grain, is demanded from Eglon, from the nation of Israel. This was the fruit of their hard work. This was all year laboring, putting effort in, and then giving it away and having nothing to show for it. That can be pretty demoralizing. When you've grafted, when you've worked, when you've toiled and you've ended up with pretty much nothing to show for it. You can feel as though you're limited. You can feel as though that there are limitations that are being applied to you that you just can't get past. I had this when I was running. Now, I spent a little while running. It was a little while, in fairness. It wasn't very long. But I was a little while. And I got up to 20 minutes on the treadmill. 20 minutes. It took me ages to get to 20 minutes. And sometimes I didn't do 20 minutes consecutively. I had to sit down halfway through. But I got to sort of 20 minutes. And then I hit a limit. And I just couldn't get past 20 minutes. It was not possible. It was not possible. When I got to 20 minutes, or sort of 19:30 on the clock, I started, practically dying, actually, at that point. I was very close to death at that point. But I managed to just about get to 20 minutes and then crumpled on a heap. But I built up to that. Just wasn't getting past it. And you ever going to make this 21 minutes, Mark? Is 21 minutes ever going to be normal? And it's with that backdrop that we're introduced to Ehud. Ehud was himself a man of seeming limitation. Traditionally, he's considered to have been small in stature. But alongside that, he has a physical disability, a limitation in that he does not have the use of his right arm. He's referred in Scripture to being left-handed, but the Hebrew there means that he was left-handed because his right hand was not working. Perhaps he didn't have a right hand. Perhaps it was disabled in some way. Whatever. He was left-handed because his right hand wasn't working. You know, in the word left in the Old English was a synonym for being weak. And even today, it was, but even today, in our language and sayings, people who are left-handed are poked fun at. They are. The word dexterous, we think is someone who is skilled at that. Dexterous means right-handed. Ambidextrous means you can use both your hands. You would think. It just means that you've got two right hands, not a left and a right. We'd say that someone who can't dance has got what? Two left feet. I tell you, it's weighted against the lefties. It is. Weighted against. Any lefties in here? Apart from a couple on the front? Just, two, three people. The weak people. To be left-handed in the ancient world meant that if you were children, you would be taught out of it. But for Ehud, that's not the case. He's not just naturally left-handed, he's naturally limited because he has no right. That's all he's got. Being a Benjamite, Ehud was part of one of the fighting tribes of Israel, them along with Gad. But he didn't really look the part for that. No one chose Ehud to be on their team when it was time to play. And to make matters worse, Benjamin means son of my right hand. Going back to Jacob putting his right hand of inheritance upon Benjamin. Being passed down, there's no right hand. See, Ehud and his limitations, they just didn't fit in. How many times has Ehud been told he's not able? He could not make it. That he was going to be limited in what he was able to achieve. How many times has someone pointed out to Ehud that it was ironic that he was born a Benjamite? How many times had he been told that the best thing for him was to be off the front line, unlike the rest of the Benjamites? What you need to do with Ehud is to stop being involved in what God is doing. You don't have the right qualities, the right abilities, the right talent, the right skill set, the right character. And maybe he has dreams and hopes of living out his calling as a Benjamite. Maybe he saw that oppression because Jericho, the city of palms, was located in Benjamin in the tribal area. And so he's kind of seeing this firsthand. Despite his limitation, I'm sure that it grated upon him to see what was happening. But what could he do? You want to be a deliverer, Ehud? Deliver these to the king. See, why send a proper soldier into enemy territory? Send someone who was expendable, someone who didn't matter, someone who wasn't capable of fighting, someone who couldn't make a difference. And so Ehud gets the job of delivering the tribute. Maybe it wasn't Ehud's first time. Maybe he went year after year. Ehud's name meant give thanks to God. That's what Ehud means. It means the word means. But he can't even live up to his name. Because what he's got now, he's offering, should have been going to God, to give thanks to God. But he's given it to Eglon. And as he walks into Jericho to hand over that tribute, his arrival is announced to Eglon. Hey, look, give thanks to God's back. He's here again. And in his weakness and in his limitation and in his restriction, Ehud wanted to break the mold that has been limiting the Israelites for the last 18 years. And you know what? As we start looking through the story of Ehud, something is stirred. Something is stirring within him. See, this year was different. We know that because it says God was raising him up as a deliverer. The man who others paid no attention to, who they took not seriously. Somehow in his spirit, potential was birthed. Somehow, the limitation of the past, the things that had bound him in the past, were becoming just a little looser. There was some sort of whisper within his spirit. And he's been crafting this sword. It's a two-edged sword. And this year, he was going to be the Benjamite that others didn't see, but that God knew was there. I wonder if that's you. I wonder if that's you. Do you look down on yourself, only seeing your limitations, but thinking that there must be more to me than this? Encouraged, because God looks beyond what you're seeing today. It was natural for the guards to check for weapons when someone entered into the presence of the king, but this was Ehud. What was he going to do? They thought, as they maybe patted it down, go through the motions of checking his left side. Is there anything there? No, there's nothing there. Maybe they laughed. Maybe they were amused at him being left-handed. Ehud had secured this cubit-long sword to his right thigh, probably inside his right thigh. And it's gone unnoticed in all the frivolity that's been targeted upon him. And he enters into see Eglon, and we read this with a sense of, is he going to do it? Is this the moment? Is Ehud going to be the hero? And we're kind of let down a little bit. We're let down a little bit. Because the tribute is handed over. Eglon leaves the room. The opportunity has passed. Frustration engulfs Ehud all the way back as they leave Jericho and they get back to Gilgal. Why didn't he just do it? Why does he doubt himself? Why didn't he see the plan through? Maybe this was just Ehud of old. And as he's heading towards Gilgal, maybe he saw the altar set up by Joshua as the nation of Israel crossed over the Jordan. Maybe he saw the place where the ark for a little while had resided. Maybe he remembered the story of the nation's circumcision ceremony of commitment. And this view of his limitation. And then the realization that God had raised him up. And whilst the rest of the party, the people have gone with him, whilst they continue and they continue to ride and they go in the opposite direction to Jericho, the sight that we see is Ehud turning round and heading back because his job was not finished. Oh, look, give thanks is back. Wonder what he wants this time. Sentries looking as he heads back into Jericho. Because of his past, because of the things that had limited him, he was able to, without causing great concern, gain access to Eglon once more. And he tickles the ears, so to speak, of the king, telling him, I've got a private message from God. I've got a secret message for you from God. And Ehud and Eglon, he's fascinated. He's desperate to hear this. So eagerly he sends away all the guards, the soldiers, the servants, and it's just him and Ehud. There is no danger. Ehud. Nothing to worry about. There's no threat. It's just Ehud, a left-handed Benjamite. What could he possibly do? Now they're together alone. It's warm outside. Eglon has been sat in the roof chamber. He's trying to keep cool. He stands up from his seat and he walks down to meet Ehud. He's like this, Eglon, walking down from the cool chamber. He's about to get to the bottom of the stairs where he meets with Ehud, who stood this way, kind of thing. Ehud, he again grabs the sword, and as he's coming down, he sticks it into Eglon. The Bible's quite graphic. The kids must have loved the story. Not only is Eglon killed, the sword pierces his bowels. And it's kind of all over the floor. You get the picture. It's a mess. It's a mess. It's all over the floor. Bowels are empty. Motions have been moved. You get the picture. Suffice to say that when the servants get near to where he's at, even though it's behind the door, they get the sense that he's perhaps using the facilities. Give it 10. Let's give it 10. And a little bit more. And as time passes, they get increasingly concerned over the king. They eventually unlock the door. They find Eglon dead. But by the time they did, Ehud has escaped. He's had that time delay to be able to get out of the way. He goes, he brings reinforcements who came back. They overcome the Moabites. And on that day, they start out 80 years of limitationless time without the Moabites being upon them. It is a great story. And I'm sure some of the kids in Israel growing up, they would have listened to that story with great amusement as that's being retold. But aside from it being a great story, I want you to see three things in this. Because one way or another, we all have our Ehud moments. And like Ehud, we need to learn to live without the limitations that could easily keep us in a place where we're missing out on living a life that God has called us to. So the first thing I want you to see here is that your background is not a prerequisite to your future. We see Ehud as a hero at the end of the story, a man of bravery in what he did, but that was not his background. That's not where he came from. That's not what his makeup was. See, the difference for Ehud came when God intervened in his life and raised him up as a deliverer. Without God, there is no deliverer. He remains on delivery duty. The son of the right hand with no right hand, limited and handicapped, was not going to be involved. But time and time again, God takes our limitation, our handicap, and turns it into his handiwork. He takes the weak things, and in him, they become strong. God takes us from where we are, in whatever situation we find ourselves in, and he adopts us, he saves us, he accepts us, and he changes us. We are not what we were. Not because of anything that we do, but because God raises us up and takes us out of where we were and places us into his purposes and to his plans. And when God does this, and when God intervenes in our lives, like he did with Ehud, the things of the past are no longer the things that define our future. Right at the end of the story, the Israelites defeat the Midianites. And I read that. They killed 10,000. I read that and I think, why could they not do that the day before? Because all Ehud did was he killed one man. The odds had not changed. There was no difference. One man had gone. He wasn't even a fighting man. One man had gone. Their mindset had changed. They remembered again who they were and who God was. They were living under a limit and there was no need for them to do that. And nor do we. Our God is bigger. Our God is stronger. Our God is mightier. Our God is tougher. Our God is more persistent. Our God is more dominant. Our God is more capable. He has more power and he has more clout than anything that we are going to face. And that doesn't change. But at times we can forget about it. And we can live under the impression that that is not the case. And that's when we live with limits. Limited in what we can do and what we do for him. You know what? We need to learn to keep reminding ourselves of the truth. Stop focusing upon our changeable perception of God's power. Number 2, even when we doubt ourselves, God can still use us. I'm always amazed when I read the end of Matthew. Never cease to be amazed by this. Jesus is back with them. He's been resurrected. The disciples are with him. They're on the mountain. Jesus is about to give the Great Commission. Go into all the world. And it says that some doubted. Jesus is there. He's been resurrected. They've seen the miracles. They've seen the healing. They've seen Lazarus come out from the dead. They've seen the demons being removed. They've seen all that sort of stuff. Jesus back alive after being dead. And yet some doubted. And the fact that Ehud had to turn around after putting the sword on under his cloak when he first went to see Eglon tells me that he was struggling. He was struggling with it. He knew what he had to do, but he was struggling. And as he left Jericho and as he went back through Gilgal, he could have kept on going and he didn't need to turn back. He could have gone home, he could have pondered, he could have rued the missed opportunity, and for another year the nation would have been limited and oppressed. And that can put him on a downward spiral. And so to us, we can think of ourselves, we've let God down. We failed him. We should have done that, but we didn't. Feels so bad. And then we stop looking for opportunities because we don't want to feel like that again. We limit ourselves from stepping out for fear of further failure. Don't think it's for me. I can't really do that. I'm not good at doing that. We need to remember the Benjamite without a right hand, because he was also no good at that. For all the world, he was the worst option that could have been chosen. And given the opportunity, he doubts. He doesn't go through with it. He misses the opportunity. But missed opportunities don't need to stay that way. And Ehud returned. Don't limit what you do, because you have doubts about you. God will and can still use you. Finally, even when we don't have all the answers, it should not stop us from stepping out and getting started. Someone said that faith is like going downstairs in the dark. You know the kind of direction you're heading in, even if you can't see where you are going to end up. And getting into the position to kill Eglon was one thing, but getting away from that was something quite different. There were many ways that this could have played out very differently and very badly. Ehud himself could have been cornered, could have been killed. But it did not stop him starting and trusting God to deal with the rest of the plan for himself. We know from our own experiences, I'm sure, that God is very active in the detail, that he leaves nothing to chance, but meticulously plans all things. God knows how to get you into the right place at the right time and bring the right people alongside you. And if ever you need to be reminded of how God plans, then remember Ehud and just how Eglon was split open for the very purpose of delaying the time so that Ehud could escape. Don't limit what you can do for God because you cannot see what's coming next. Have faith and trust that God does know and God has planned it, and things will work out according to his will. We will never have things lined up perfectly. It's not for us to do. What is for us to do is to take the first step and then see how God brings delivery afterwards. No one would have considered Ehud to be a deliverer. To those who knew him or saw him from a distance, perhaps even looking at himself, the mere thought of Ehud doing what he did was just crazy. And yet no one else could have done what Ehud did. And that's exactly what happens when we do not limit God in our lives. When we keep who he is clear in our mind. When we allow him to lead and to guide us. When we learn to live our lives beyond limit for his kingdom. Can we do that? Can we follow his example? With all the limitations that he had, with the difficulties that he had, can we follow that example and see what God can do through us and for his kingdom? Let's pray, shall we? God, we thank you for the example that we've read about today in Ehud. Man who had limitations and restrictions, and a man who was not able, the one who was not an obvious choice. And yet, despite all those things, you took his weakness and you made it your strength. And so, God, when we consider ourselves, may we consider ourselves in the light of your power, in the light of your might, and in the light of your ability. But it is when we stand in that, God, we will see you move.